attending future MIT Alpha Omega events, we have an interest form. So if you're interested and you liked our event, just check it out, and we'll contact you and get you in the loop. So thanks everybody for coming. And I'll pass it on to Alex, who I think has the questions from the chat.
Yeah, I have them. Cool. So yeah, some questions that we got was, I'm interested in Dr. Rodriguez's story. What was his experience writing the book? And did he face backlash when he was writing it?
Very good question. Well, I made, when I was working on my dissertation, my dissertation was how abolitionists used the Bible to argue against slavery. And so I mean, I read so much literature, and I also noticed while I was, you know, in graduate school, that some of the books that I read would come straight out and say, you know, that Christianity is to blame for racism and slavery. And so I also understood that a lot of people who grew up in the church would have a hard time reconciling their faith with what they were learning, particularly at the university level. You know, for some reason, I mean, the history courses in the grade school level, they kind of gloss over. I mean, they mention slavery, but they really don't get into the, you know, the weeds of really how that system works. But when you go to college, when you go to a university and you take a history course, they get very detailed about it, and so it's very difficult to kind of square what you're learning with what, you know, the Bible says, particularly when you read passages like, you know, slaves obey your master and that sort of thing. And so I just thought it was really important to, because I'm the type of person that for many years, I actually, particularly with my quiet times, I just read through the Bible. I just read from Genesis to Revelation, you know, just to read a little bit at a time, my daily devotional. So I had for many years, I kind of had a working knowledge of what different parts of the Bible said. But when I started to study American slavery, and it really opened my eyes, I said, wait a minute, you know, and then I was exposed to the literature of pro-slavery people. I thought, wait a minute, this does not square. And so I just thought I'd write something for Christians and for people who had doubts about the Bible, to help them be able to square and be able to make sense. And I, you know, actually, it really wasn't too hard to write. Now, when I wrote it in a way that I wanted it to be language that was very easy, very accessible. I find that a lot of scholars, when they write, it's just hard to decipher, it's hard to read it. Although, you know, after you read it over time, you kind of get used to the language, but, you know, everyday folks is just, you know, so I tried to write it in a way that's accessible, and it has been well received, really well received. With people who read it and they go, wow, this really explains, you know, how American slavery was very different from slavery, even if you want to call it that, in the Bible. And, you know, and if you're familiar with, a lot of times, you know, they would use Abraham as an example, or Jacob as an example, as a slave owner. But when you really drill down, you really read the stories, and then you compare them to what transpired in this country, it's just night and day. And so it's been really well received. Usually the people that push back against it are people that really haven't read it. Once they read it, they go, oh, okay, that makes sense. You know, and so it's been well received so far. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did. I mean, I didn't ask it, but I think it did. Yeah, someone else asked, how do you help educate others if they do not see racism?
That's a tough one. As a matter of fact, I'm dealing with that right now. You know, and it's a lot of times, to be honest with you, it's people that came here and did not grow up here a lot of times. It's funny, usually, obviously, you know, African Americans, they see it, you know, it's easy to see. White Americans, you know, it takes them a while, but they, they get it in the sense that it's easier. We can have a conversation. Who really struggles with it are people who come from countries where there's a dictator there, and they're used to being completely, their rights being completely taken away, and they come here and they go, particularly if they identify Hispanics. I'm part Puerto Rican, right? So a lot of my Hispanic friends who identify white, a lot of times they go, what are you talking about racism? And what are you talking about oppression? They cannot, it's hard for them. It's hard for them. And so you have to really have conversations, but a lot of times they just don't want to hear it. They are sometimes the hardest people. And so really the best way a lot of times is just any opportunity you have to explain, but you have to encourage them. They have to really want to educate themselves as well. It's a two-way street. You educate, you explain, but at the same time, they have to also take an interest and and to educate themselves. Unfortunately, a lot of people in this country, particularly if they just had a grade school education in terms of history, are not as well versed on this part of our history. In many ways, this part of our history has been obscured, except for the last maybe 10 years or so, where a lot more movies have come out and so forth that kind of expose things like 12 Years a Slave, Birth of a New Nation, movies like that have exposed the institution. But in many ways, this institution has been obscured from the general population.
Wow. Thank you for that. Another question. How should one react when dealt with racism experienced in a church setting?
Well, it just so happens that I sit on the ICOC diversity committee team when we talk about these types of issues. And this is what we tell people. You have to go to the leadership and have conversations about this. You just have to talk about it with respect, with gentleness, but you have to point this out. And then you have to urge, leaders, to be concerned about their flock if they want to keep church together. Because right now we're fraying at the edges because of what's been happening in the news. And it's not letting up. And the leaders of our churches have to be sensitive to this. And so this takes communication, gentle, respectful, humble, but persistent. You can't let up, because a lot of times two things have happened. The leaders have they have a lot of things on their radar, and if you're not pushing, and like the squeaky wheel gets the oil, that's what you have to be. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about, the parable of the widow. She kept going to the judges, and the judge says, finally, if she's going to wear me out if I don't pay attention to this. And then also, not only that, encourage other members to come and speak to their leaders about this. And we encourage churches to start what are called squads, social, cultural, unity. I'm not good with acronyms, but it's you get an idea. But it's a group of disciples that are mature, of different races, that come together and talk about this issue of race. Whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, to come and talk about this. And so they form sort of like a group to be able to inform and to educate the church, to advise the leadership, and also provide a safe place for members to come and talk about matters of race in the church. We have to also remember that our churches that are mixed race are the exception in evangelical Christianity in this country. 90% of the churches, or 95% of the churches, are either all white or all black or all Asian or all Hispanic. So what we're doing here, it's very much New Testament, like the first century. And you guys saw that map, and incidentally, that map had people from Europe, from Asia, and from Africa coming together. And that's what our churches looked like. And if you read the book of Acts, they were fraught with issues, starting with the Grecian widows feeling like they were being overlooked, to all the way to when they met with Cornelius, to they considered the issue of circumcision, to when Paul rebuked Peter in front of everybody because he was being racist towards his Gentile brothers and sisters. So the first century church was fraught with these types of issues. They had to confront it on a lot of different levels. It's going to be the same here. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be easy, but it must be done. And it's what God expects. It's counterculture, and it's counterculture, and it's also counterintuitive, and it's counter our tendency is to want to stay with our own people that we feel comfortable with. But God wants us to come together more and more. Hope that makes sense. And as a professor, I tend to be long-winded. I apologize.
I think that was a great answer. Yeah, that was really good. I like the idea of squad. I like that.
Yeah, we're encouraging. And a lot of churches are doing that, by the way. A lot of churches are doing that.
Yeah, I think we have one more question, and it's, I don't know, it's quite broad, but could you talk about Egyptian slavery and maybe the difference between that?
Oh, okay. Well, so yeah, I talked about that. Egyptian slavery, if you remember, when the Israelites came into Egypt, starting in Genesis, they had their own community. If you remember, you guys remember, they lived in Goshen, right? And so all of them lived in Goshen. They had their own homes. Mother, father, children all lived together. And how do we know they had their own homes? If you remember, you remember the 10 plagues? You remember the last plague where they had to take blood of lambs and put it over their doorposts? So that tells you right there that they had their own homes, right? And so the Egyptians allowed the Israelites to be able to be self-contained. That's number one. Number two, which is different from American slavery. American slavery, families were spread out over different plantations. You could have a father living on one plantation, a mother living in another plantation, and the children either with her or in other places because they have been sold off. So the African Americans were not in their own self-contained communities. That's number one. Number two, the Egyptian slavery did not involve human trafficking. Nowhere in the book of Exodus do you read of families being destroyed because they were being sold to the Babylonians and to the Persians or to the Assyrians and so forth. They were able to stay together and they were able to, and not only that, they had their homes, they had their property, and they also had their cattle and so forth. If you remember, that was a part of the negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh. He said, well, Pharaoh said, well, you can leave, but you got to leave the cattle behind, or that sort of thing. And Moses said, no, we're leaving with everything, with all of our possessions. The other thing is that when thirdly, the Israelites, when they left Egypt, the Egyptians actually gave them in a form of reparations, in the sense that they left with great wealth. In American slavery, when slavery was abolished, the African Americans received nothing for their labor. There was no severance, there was no land, there were no cattle, no money, no nothing. They left empty-handed. Now, one way that they are similar is with extermination. The Egyptians were aggressive in trying to kill Israelites. But of course, in this country, African Americans, either whether it was during slavery, it was nothing to kill a slave. It was killing property. As a matter of fact, slave owners took out an insurance policy on slaves. In the event of something happening to them and they were killed because they ran away, they were fully reimbursed. So there was there has been extermination of African Americans, not only during slavery, but also after slavery with lynching. And then, of course, now the uproar is, the killing of African American citizens by representatives of the state police. So this is, in that way, they're similar. But at least with Egyptian slavery, the Israelites had their own communities, they had their property, they had their families intact, and they were not subject to human trafficking. So in that way, American slavery was worse.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it. That's all the questions we had, and you answered them really well.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for coming today, Dr. Rodriguez, and I thank all of you guys and everyone who joined. I hope you enjoyed it. So yeah.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, and let me